If you grew up in the 90s or 2000s and went to an arcade, a movie theater, a laundromat, or any place that was known to keep arcade machines, chances are you've seen a Daytona USA cabinet at least once in your life. Daytona USA is a landmark arcade game from Sega released in 1994, developed by the legendary Sega AM2 studio, responsible for industry-shaking games like Space Harrier, Outrun, and Virtua Fighter. You control the Hornet, a blue and red stock car, as you race on one of 3 tracks in a race to the finish. It cannot be underlined enough just how much of an event this game was. Nothing on consoles or PCs at the time looked, played, or ran as immaculately as Daytona USA. I was a very young child when this game came out, but one particularly vivid memory for me back then was my mom taking me to the movies to go see a Goofy movie, which released about a year after Daytona, and while we were online in the concession stand, I see at least 8 or so people crowding over a Daytona USA machine to the left. I couldn't see much of what was going on because, well, I was a kid and not very tall, but from what I could hear, and that cabinet was very loud, the game sounded like the absolute personification of excitement. Daytona USA is probably the example of the blue sky aesthetic Sega AM2's games were known for. Blue skies, colorful visuals, good vibes, and absolutely immaculate presentation are all a part of the package here. Of particular note is the game's vocal soundtrack, composed by Sega music legend Takenobu Mitsuyoshi. Of all of Sega's arcade games, I'd argue Daytona eclipses even Outrun as a game whose music is a necessary part of the experience. If you haven't already noticed, I'm a really big fan of this game. If you've been paying attention to the channel, you know I'm a really big fan of fighting games. You might be wondering, well, okay, but what does Daytona USA have to do with fighting games? Well, buckle up your seatbelts and start your engine, because we're about to talk about one of the most certifiably insane character inclusions in fighting game history. And I say that without an ounce of hyperbole. Let's get into it. Fighters Megamix is a 1996 crossover fighting game for the Sega Saturn, and notably to this day, the only fighting game in Sega AM2's catalog to be exclusive to consoles and lacking an arcade release. This game crosses over the Virtua Fighter series with Fighting Vipers, both of whom are Sega AM2 developed series. Even if you haven't played it, you've probably heard of Virtua Fighter or at least played a game inspired by it. Virtua Fighter's influence on the gaming industry as a whole is pretty massive and honestly deserves an entire video unto itself, but suffice to say, if you're watching this video, you likely know of the series. Fighting Vipers is something of a sister series and not as well known as its older sibling. If I had to make a comparison, it's kind of the Darkstalkers to Virtua Fighter Street Fighter. The character designs are zanier, the moveset's more over the top, brutal, and seemingly not at all based on real martial arts like Virtua Fighter, and the game just doesn't take itself seriously. To its benefit, I might add. Fighting Viper's main gimmick is its armor system. Over the course of a fight, hitting your opponent with certain attacks repeatedly will damage their armor and blow off chunks of it in real time. It's gimmicky, but kind of impressive technically. It also serves as a gameplay function, as characters with less armor take more damage, which makes total sense. Even with the disparity between both games, Fighters Megamix blends these two series surprisingly well. When you play Fighters Megamix for the first time, the game defaults to a playstyle that makes the game play like the faster and somewhat weightier Fighting Vipers, while also allowing for armor breaks. However, you also have the option of setting the game to Virtua Fighter mode, which alters the physics to be floatier and the game more deliberate in its pace. Now, as I said before, the game crosses over both Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers, at least initially. See, the game's single-player mode consists of themed arcade routes. One is themed after Virtua Fighter, one after Fighting Vipers, one sees you fighting all of the women in the game, and so on and so forth. As you progress through the arcade courses, you start unlocking secret characters, and that's when Fighters Megamix really plays its hand. It's not just a Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers crossover, it's a general Sega crossover, particularly involving Sega series that Sega AM2 worked on themselves. So then you start unlocking characters like Rent-A-Hero from the Japan-only Mega Drive game of the same name, the two Sega AM2 created characters for Sonic the Fighters, Bean and Bark, and even characters cut from previous games like Siba, a character originally intended for Virtua Fighter 1 and replaced by Akira. Fighters Megamix isn't a game that's talked about very often, if at all. Not because it's a bad game or anything, but it's a Sega Saturn exclusive Sega fighting game. The only people who talk about it these days are diehard Sega fans. But if there's one thing people do know about the game, it's the character you unlock from the game's final arcade route, the Daytona Hornet itself. And no, this isn't a joke video. The Hornet stands on its rear wheels and starts throwing tires? Yeah, let's go with tires. So, the Hornet is a pretty interesting character. For one, it uses the Fighting Viper's armor system, so the pieces of the car can actually be knocked off. More on that in a bit. The implementation of this for Hornet specifically more than likely references the damage system in Daytona, USA, which saw the car get visually banged up in real time the more you hit cars or ran into walls. This is a pretty standard immersion feature in racing games today, but back then, this was pretty novel stuff. Moreover though, Hornet is weirdly enough, mostly a moveset clone of Bond from Fighting Vipers. A lot of Bond's most distinct attacks can be done with the Hornet, though you'll have to activate its second form to get most of those moves. Now, in Capcom vs. Legacy, I generally lay out move lists by special moves, notable command normals, and super moves. Sega fighting game move lists are crazy expansive in comparison, so instead what I'll do is highlight the most notable and useful techniques. The move names here are also taken from the Fighters Megamix Megabook's Ultimate Guide released by ASCII in Japan. You see, Fighters Megamix has a training mode that allows you to look at each character's moveset. Every character except for the secret ones, that is. So referencing a guide was the only way I could get most of these move names. Front drive is Hornet's standard punch. I'm not exactly sure how it sends its tires out like that, but sure. Forward, and punch gives you mad drive, which has the Hornet get back on the ground like a car and drive at the opponent. The range is kind of not great though, and the damage isn't anything to write home about either. It does bear mentioning that this attack has a low profile and does go under certain attacks from your opponent, depending on their attack height. Double wishbone is done with hitting down forward diagonally and kick. Chobon is a headbutt attack Hornet gets from Bon. Spark Ignition is arguably the most important ability in Hornet's moveset. Hornet instantly sheds its armor, leaving its internals exposed. The burst does a little bit of damage, but the move itself has one big perk and one big caveat. In this mode, Hornet has access to 99% of its moveset, though it does lose mad drive interestingly enough. The vast majority of the moves it gains are from Bon as well. The trade-off is that Hornet has absolutely abysmal defense in this mode, and a couple good hits will put it down really quickly. It's a better character in this mode, but it raises the question of why you'd want to play them when you have not one but two variations of Bon in game to choose from. Being able to instantly shed your armor is an ability Fighting Vipers characters have. Hornet's treated as one here, so it makes sense that it has it, though locking most of his moveset behind it was definitely a choice. One move Hornet gets access to now is Violent Fire Show Break Cannon, a two-part attack done by executing a reverse Dragon Punch and Punch, followed by a standard Dragon Punch and Punch. Last Breakdown is a low-hitting move done by holding down back and then quickly pivoting over to down forward and pressing Punch. Hornet surprisingly gets Bond's Dragon Upper attack too, done with a Dragon Punch motion and Punch. There's an additional variant of this as well, Double Dragon Upper. Do another Dragon Punch motion before you land from the first to initiate this one. Go! Hornet also has the Tetsuzanko, done with back, then forward twice, and punch and kick at the same time. Bon has this move as well, but he himself cribbed this from Akira, who can claim it to be his most iconic move. The Tetsuzanko itself is derived from the Chinese martial art Baji Xuan, which centers around physical strikes done primarily with elbows and shoulders. Akira himself is probably the most recognizable user of this technique in gaming, but it's a lot more widespread than you'd think. Characters that utilize the Tetsuzanko or variations of it specifically include Yoon, Paul, Bayonetta, and so many more I'm probably forgetting. Sugar Punch and the Fighterverse have really informative videos on this specific subject, and I highly recommend checking them out if you'd like to learn more about the technique as it relates to gaming and Bajichuan as a whole. Hornet's front throw is deadly wheel spin, where it spins its tires on your face. That looks pretty painful. Its rear throw is downforce compressor, where it slams the front of the car on the opponent, downing them. That also looks pretty painful. And here are Hornet's two color variations. Color 2 is taken directly from the manual transmission mode in Daytona, USA. There, you have a choice between automatic transmission and manual, the former giving you the car's iconic red and blue scheme and the latter an orange and red scheme. Both are viable, but manual allows for more precision when drifting and higher overall top speeds. If you ever plan on learning Daytona, I highly recommend learning how to play on manual on the beginner course. Speaking of, Hornet's stage in this game is 3-7 Speedway. This stage is treated as a Fighting Viper style stage and thus has a gate that can be broken at the end of matches. 3-7 Speedway is the first and probably most iconic course in Daytona, USA. The track itself is very loosely based on the real-life Daytona International Speedway in Florida. It gets its name from the slot machine that can be found installed in a rock formation about halfway into the track. You can even interact with the slot machine if you press a certain button, and the HD ports on PS3 and Xbox 360 even grant a trophy and achievement respectively for doing so. The final turn in the track is the toughest one, and the one where you'll likely get the hang of drifting. The most notable landmark here is the mountain with Sonic the Hedgehog carved into it. Slightly off-topic, unsolicited Daytona USA tip here, but if you're learning manual transmission in that game, I recommend downshifting the first gear once you pass the black sign on the right. Let the car lean into the turn and shift in the third gear, and as the car straightens out, go back the fourth. In Fighter's Megamix, the stage itself seems to be positioned near the arena area with the crowd watching. The glass enclosure you can see on top in the background is on the real-life track, as well as every version of this track that appears in the Daytona games. If you look closely at the background, you may notice a peculiar opening. This is presumably where the cars enter the track from prior to the race, and this is also present in the original track. In fact, the opening shots of the race complete screen in Daytona USA are framed from here. Fighter's Megamix stages aren't packed with a ton of detail, so it's pretty neat to see them include an environmental detail as small and missable as that. The stage theme is The King of Speed, the song used for 3-7 Speedway in Daytona USA. Interestingly enough, this seems to be the original arcade arrangement of the song. When Sega would port their arcade games to Saturn, they'd usually rearrange the soundtrack for these home console ports. These home arrangements are used for the Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers characters, so it's interesting to see them opt for the arcade version for Hornet, since Daytona USA also got a Saturn exclusive arranged soundtrack. Now, before we end the video, we actually have one more game to touch on. See, Fighter's Megamix actually released on two platforms. One being the Saturn, of course, but a portable recreation of it was made for the Tiger Gamecom. I was going to skip over this, but Hornet is one of the few characters that made it onto the roster of this version, and I want to cover their entire fighting game history, good and bad. The Tiger Gamecom was a handheld gaming system from Tiger Electronics. If you grew up in the 90s, you probably played at least one of these before. I personally remember borrowing a Sonic-themed one from a friend as a kid. There were even some fighting game-themed ones, funnily enough. Guile Winquote has a fantastic video delving into those that I'd highly recommend watching. The Gamecom was Tiger's follow-up to their failed R-Zone handheld, a Virtual Boy-esque device that seemed designed to make their brand of standalone handheld games more immersive, and more like buying Game Boy games, as they came on their own cartridges. Weirdly enough, R-Zone had a decent amount of Sega support, with Virtua Fighter 1 and 2, Nights in the Dreams, and even Panzer Dragoon, if you can believe it, getting releases on it. Gamecom continued this support with Sega, though now the games themselves were more ambitious. relatively speaking anyway. The Gamecom does have the unique distinction of being the first dedicated gaming handheld to have a touchscreen and internet connectivity, which is kind of neat. Fighters Megamix found its way to Gamecom in 1998, and yeah, it's rough. The best way I can describe it is if someone tried to take the Genesis version of Virtua Fighter 2 and ported it to the Game Boy. There's a hilariously low amount of frames of animation per attack for every character. The hitboxes for everything that isn't a low kick barely function, and the music is just, well, listen. The movesets have been pared back massively from the Saturn original. Characters get 2 or so unique attacks outside of basic punches and kicks, along with a special attack that can be spammed whenever you like since there's no resource tied to it. The armor mechanic is surprisingly still in place with the Fighting Vipers characters in here, though Hornet lost it. Hornet itself is unlocked by completing Course C in single player mode, so if you want to subject yourself to that, be my guest. I'd recommend exercising some self-love and playing a better game though. Hornet only really has 2 moves of note here. Some weird looking uppercutted attempts to do, but the hitbox doesn't seem to really work properly, even when I'm right in the opponent's face. And its special move, Mad Dash, which it surprisingly retains from the Saturn version. Even funnier, it has a better hitbox this time around. The AI doesn't block low in this game at all, so if you want to cheese the AI, just spam this over and over. This goes for just about any other low attack in the game as well. Hornet doesn't have the most stellar fighting game showing, but it's still legitimately one of my favorite fighting game character roster picks of all time. It showcases just how much fun a developer can have when testing the boundaries of what can and can't be a fighting game character. Hornet's up there with Blitztank as one of the best examples of that, and I sincerely wish modern fighting games would attempt to take a swing at something like this again, as unlikely as that is. Hornet would later go on a cameo in other non-fighting games, like Ridge Racer Vita, and most notably Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing Transformed, as part of the character Ages. That's going to do it for this video. I'm really glad I got the opportunity to expand the kinds of fighting games I can talk about, and I hope you all enjoy watching it just as much as I did making it. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next video.